Hey everyone, Kevin Marks here from Fast Tracks, and I just want to wish everyone happy holidays and hope everybody is safe and doing well. So welcome to another episode of Upstairs in the Workshop. This is volume 5, and tonight we're going to cover filing tips on using our point form gauge, and then we're also going to cover some soldering tips as well. And from the previous videos, we've got some better sound, a little better camera angle, so hopefully everything should be in a little more focus. So if you're new to Upstairs in the Workshop, I just want to say welcome, and this is kind of a casual glimpse of my space up here, my track building workshop, and it's a lot more casual than what, a formal clinic normally is. And the whole concept behind it is just to be a mentor to you and try to give you some tips, show you what to do, and more importantly, show you what not to do, which can save you a lot of time and frustration. And all of this should be very enjoyable for you. So, got a couple cool things that arrived this week that I just want to share. And Christmas came early, so we have an ESU Command Control Center. That's the new wireless one that came out, so that'll be for another project. And then I just got some of these neat little buggers. These are O-scale power trucks. So these are for my brass interurban cars, and check these out. There's actually a can motor inside with a gearbox and a double belt drive. And the neat thing is that can motor sits below the bolster of the truck, so the truck can swivel all the way around. So these little buggers allow for a full interior in some of the cars. And speaking of cars, you may have seen this in a previous video. I'm working on this brass O-scale interurban body where I wanted to modernize it, so I had to pull off all the roof detail on the top and then down underneath, kind of hold that close, I milled some plugs and then torch soldered those in. So you're probably asking, why am I showing you all of this? Well, the skills that you learn in soldering track also apply to other aspects of the hobby as well. And when you get confident in building track, you'll also be confident in hacking up a somewhat expensive O-scale interurban car body or freight car or whatever you may have. And the skills are exactly the same. And really what it all comes down to are 4 things. And I'll cover those 4 things in just a moment. So let's dive right into it. So on the last Upstairs in the Workshop, I showed you this pretty sweet dual crossing that I built. And if you notice on here just how sharp those points are, and what we're going to do first in this video is I'm going to show you how to get those nice sharp points when you're doing your filing. So you can also achieve those as well. So the first thing you want to do is obviously get one of our point form tools. And if you have one of those, it's one of the greatest things that we have. So when you slide your rail in like so, you'll notice that there's a little bit of play. And I'll hold this close to the microphone. You can actually hear that little bit of play. So before you start filing, there are a couple things that you want to do to make sure everything goes nice and smooth. So when you put the rail in, you slide the rail in to where it's ground here, and this is the key. This is the secret right here. So when the rail is in the right position, you hold it down with your finger, pressing it into the fixture, like what I'm doing here. And then after that, I hand tighten it on the ends, and then I'll grab my Allen wrench, and then I will tighten it down just like this. That way, the fixture itself is grabbing, you can kind of see right here, is grabbing the base of the rail, and the rail is sitting very flat to this filing fixture. So once that's done, the way you file too also makes a difference as well. So if you have the file that we saw on the website, it works great. And then what I do is when I'm filing this, I actually try not to touch the sides of the fixture when I start. You want to make long strokes, use the entire length of the file, not just the middle. Otherwise, you're going to wear down the middle of the file, and it's just going to take you longer to file a little bit later. So when you do file everything, what I try to do is I go on an angle like this, and I try to, again, I avoid touching the side of this filing tool, and I use the entire length of the file and, you know, take a nice, even, easy stroke. Don't rush it, because when you rush it, you're going to hit the edge of the file, and then you can end up filing off part of your filing tool, and no one wants that. So, you know, go slow, take it easy, don't be aggressive, use the entire length of the file. And the way that you can tell that you did a good job in your filing, and I have another example right here, is, let me get in real tight, you can see the rail right here, and it is absolutely flush to the top of the tool. I can take my finger and I can run my finger across the top, and it's not catching on anything. So if you can't do that, you didn't secure the rail well enough in the filing tool and then secure it down. So if that does happen to you and you look at it and you say, well, you know, I probably could have done a little nicer job filing that, don't worry, you can salvage what you did without starting over. So what you want to do is just undo the rail just a little tiny bit, and then I'll take my flush cutting nippers and I'll just nip a little bit of the end off, and then from there I actually just slide it right back in and get it back in position. There we go. That one didn't quite open up all the way. Other side. It's always more fun doing this backwards. So once that you nipped off that little piece, you can bring that back down to the edge of where that ground mark is on the filing tool and get it in the right position just like that. Hold it with your thumb and then give it a quick finger tighten, just like I'm doing here, and then give it a quick little snug up with the Allen wrench, and then from there you can refile what you did, and you're literally only taking maybe a millimeter off at the most. So the other thing, when you get to the very edge, or not the edge, the end of filing, put the file flat on your fixture, and then, and I'm doing this backwards, bear with me, and then you bring it across. So then the file will kind of skip over, not skip over, but it'll kind of file and grind down that little piece of the rail. And then when your file gets past that, it ends up flat on the fixture as well, not on the side of the fixture. So just take it slow and just go all the way up and use the entire length of the file, and you are going to be just fine. So that is really a quick and easy way of getting great filing results. And I have another one here that I pulled out of the fixture that I can show you. We'll put this white piece behind it, but you can just see how razor sharp that tip is. And I built a double crossover a couple years ago, and I actually had to put band-aids on my fingertips because the points were all super, super sharp. So that's the result that you should get. If you are not getting that result, take it out, keep practicing, push the rail down when you tighten it, and you're going to be okay. So that tip works on filing the frog side, and it also works on filing the point side as well too. So super, super great tip, and I hope that really helps you get some better looking frogs, some better looking points. So now the other thing we're going to cover quick is we are going to talk about soldering. So once you get your points filed and your frog points filed, soldering is the key to make everything go together extremely well. And if you learn some good soldering tips, everything will go just fine. So I mentioned before, there's 4 things that you need to do. You need to have a hot iron, first and foremost. You need to clean everything, and we'll cover that in a little bit with some sandpaper. And then you also need to use the right type of flux. And we prefer using a paste acid-based flux, and we'll cover that in a little more detail in just a second, rather than the liquid flux that's used for electronics. That just doesn't seem to work, and it kind of goes everywhere, and I'll expand on that in just a little bit. So we have enough iron for heat, cleaning everything, proper flux, and proper solder. So 60-40 solder works great, and if you use the thin stuff that we sell on the site, you can just see how thin it is. That will help prevent you from putting too much solder on your joints. So what we're actually going to do now is actually solder up a frog, and then we're going to solder up some straight track just to demonstrate these techniques. So as I mentioned before, I want to be a good mentor to you and teach you how to do things the right way. So if you do the things I just mentioned, everything should go extremely well. So sometimes we see pictures of what people post online, and they either flood the joint with too much solder, and if that happens and you see the solder bubble, either it wasn't cleaned enough, or you didn't have enough heat, or the solder wasn't right, or a combination of all of those. But if you do what I'm going to do in this video, you're going to get some great results. The other thing too is, and we aren't quite sure why people do this, is they flood the entire tie with solder. There's no reason to do that. And I've even seen some people pre-tin their PC ties. There's no reason to do that. If you're soldering in the fixtures are designed for this little tiny gap between the bottom of the rail and the top of the tie for the solder to flow under. So if you think about it, if you pre-tin your ties, when you have a bunch of ties lined up, the rail is not sitting flat on any of them. And then when you start at one end, the rail isn't actually going to sit flat on that tie because the other ties are holding up the rail. And as you go down the line, your rail will actually be somewhat uneven. And that may not seem like a big deal, but if you're an N scale or Z scale, you know, a couple thousandths of an inch is actually a pretty big deal, and you can run into trouble. So I mentioned before cleaning. I can't stress this enough. You have to clean everything. So as an analogy, if you wanted to wax your car and your car was pretty filthy and you just hosed it off, you're going to get some of the surface contamination off, but you really aren't going to clean the surface. The same thing is with flux. Flux will get the surface contamination off, but you really need to clean the surfaces first before you start. So let's talk about rail. So microengineering rail is actually formed through a die. It's pushed through a die. It's not CNC machined. It starts out as a square or a circle and is pushed through, and the rail is formed. So there's a lubricant that's added to the rail that you want to get off before you start soldering. The thing that I like to do is just use my Dremel tool, and I like the stainless steel brush, and that stainless steel brush does a great job in getting that lubricant off, and you will be amazed how much oxidation is on your rail. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's clean. So you do that first. And then before you actually start to solder anything, I'll take some 3M 400 grit sandpaper. You can get this at Home Depot, any hardware store. And I'll actually go and I'll sand the bottom of the rail to get off that oxidation that has occurred since you wire wheeled it, which could be the same day, could be a couple days later, could be a month later. But before you solder, 400 grit sandpaper is your friend, and I'm going to show you some super clean joints as we get through all of this. And then the other thing that you want to do is just give your PC ties a quick sand. So here are two examples, and you can see the difference between the two. So this one, and I'll try to get in close, you can kind of get this out of the light there. There we go. This one was sanded, and this one still has some oxidation on it. They're brand new. I just got these a couple weeks ago, but there's still some surface oxidation that you want to take off when you're doing it. So let's get to it, and let's solder up some joints, and we'll show you just how easy this is. The other thing that I want to tell you is you don't have to put a lot of solder on it. You can just put a little bit of solder on, and if you clean everything and use some acid-based flux, you'll be fine. If you don't have any acid-based flux, we obviously sell some on our website, but if you just want to try some real quick, I picked some up at Lowe's. This is no corrode paste flux, and it's just no corrode paste flux. It says it has zinc chloride, so there's some acid in it. It does say it's non-aggressive, but it's a lot more aggressive than what a liquid flux or water-based flux will be, and this stuff works great too. So if you're in a pinch and you want to try some acid-based paste flux, you can get some of this at Lowe's. And then also, you know, we sell this on the site too, so if you have some points, use your points to get it. So I see people that have big solder bubbles on their track. There's no reason for that, and actually I tried doing that before we started the video, and I actually found that the joint that I put more solder on came apart. So here is a joint that I did. Try to get this so you can just see how clean it is. The lights are pretty bright up here in the studio. So there's really not a lot, there we go, there's a good angle. There's really not a lot of solder on here. And then I also tried putting on this tie right next to it, and I tried flooding the joint with it, and when I tried pulling them apart, the joint that had more solder actually came apart faster, and that's really because more heat was applied to the joint, and that helped the copper on the PC tie actually lift off, and it literally popped right off. So just because there's a lot of solder on your joint doesn't mean it's strong. I mean, I'm literally pulling on this, and I can't break that joint. And you can just see how nice and clean that is. I'm doing this backwards, so bear with me. You can just see how nice and clean that joint is right here. So let's get to some soldering and put these practices into work. So I'm going to move the camera down a little bit. I got it a little bit lower to the workbench so you can see exactly what's going on right here. So I soldered, and again, I'm doing this backwards, so bear with me. So I filed some points that we're going to solder up right here, and you can see just how nice and clean and sharp they are. And we're going to throw some ties on here and make this look good. So if you're just starting, actually I'm going to move the camera back up again. So if you're just starting to solder track, if you've had fixtures from us for a while and they're sitting on your shelf, you're scared to get started, the best thing you can do is just practice. Practice making components of the track. You know, practice filing. Again, I'm doing this backwards. Practice filing. There you go. You can see how nice and sharp that is. Practice filing your points first, and then grab some rail, grab some ties, and just practice soldering some straight track, which we're going to do in just a little bit. You know, if you've never done this before, you always want to practice first before you just dive right in, and just practice your solder joints and make sure they're looking good before you start. The great thing about working with metal is you can always take it apart and redo it. So when you're done practicing, you can hit your rail with some heat, pop the ties off. You're going to have to discard the ties, but then you can just take a file and get rid of that excess solder on the bottom of the rail, hit it with a little sandpaper to etch it up again, and make sure it's nice and clean, and you can reuse your rail. So it's always good to practice, 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 and you'll get some really good joints. So moving the camera back down a little bit. So here we are on the workbench, and we are going to solder these points real quick. So first thing you want to do is, and I like doing this on a board, not on the fixture, because I want to keep all the little filing bits off of the fixture, is grab some sandpaper and just give the ties, I did these before, but there's a little bit of oxidation on them, so you can clean that right off. You'll also notice I'm wearing gloves. I've got the black nitrile gloves that Home Depot sells, and these, you know, just like if you're painting, These are used to keep the oils from your fingers off of what you're going to be soldering, and keeps things nice and clean. So I'm just going to take a second and clean this off, put those in, and then I'm just going to do the bottom of the rail. The other thing you're doing is not only taking the oxidation off, but you're etching the material. And when you etch the material, you're putting little scratches in it, and that is going to give the solder a little more bite, and it'll hold on to your material a whole lot more. So I'm just going to clean these up a little bit and get those all set. So a couple other things I want to point out. Actually, let me redo this one a little bit. You know, go slow, take your time. If something doesn't look right, stop, like what we're doing here, and take care of it. So a couple other things I want to point out. I also put my safety glasses on, and those are vital anytime you're soldering. I also back here have a little Vornado fan that I got at Target, and then it's always good to have one of these fire extinguishers nearby. You never know if someone's going to bump the table, a pet might jump up, and a soldering iron might fall, and you don't want to lose your house during the holidays. So swing by Home Depot or Target and pick up those items. So now we're going to get back to soldering. Public service announcement is over, and just show you how nice and quick all of this goes. So we have our ties in the fixture, and now I'm just going to open up this paste flux and just put some flux right where the rail is going to go. And I'm just using these little micro applicator brushes. We have on the site, just about every hobby shop I've been in has them as well, and they work great for applying flux, and you can put it wherever you need it, and it's not going to move or run on you. Super, super easy. So now that we have that done, we're just going to put the rail in. The other thing that you want to do before you put your rail in is just slide it, put it in the fixture, and just make sure that it can slide. And you want to make sure that your rail sits flat. If it's binding anywhere, that means there's a little burr, and it's not going to sit flat on the rail when you actually do go and solder it. So now we're going to put some flux on the filed part of this frog point right here, and just kind of pop that in the fixture. And now once it's in the fixture, you just want to bring these two parts up nice and snug and nice and tight until they can't move any further. And that looks really good. So let's try to do a close-up right here so you can see just how nice that is looking. And then once they're in the right place, I always like to get that in frame a little bit. Move the camera just a smidge. So once they're in the right place, I like to use one of the point forms or a stockade tool and use that to hold the track down. Then what I do next is I come back and I hit each side of the rail with a little bit of flux, and then I also get the tie as well too. And I'm only soldering on one side of the rail, and I try to solder on the side that you aren't going to see, and then the solder will flow underneath the joint and come out the other side, and it will look beautiful. So we're just going to finish applying the flux right here. Everything is looking good. And then we're going to go back, move the stockade over, make sure we have flux on top of the rail, and I'll explain why in a second. And then everything looks nice and clean. So now that that's done, and tonight I'm going to be demonstrating my American Beauty resistance iron. This is a 100-watt model. This is O-scale code 125, and it's pretty big stuff. If you're soldering an N or a Z or HO, a 40-watt iron will work just fine. The techniques are exactly, well, they're similar. The other thing you want to remember when you're soldering is, put another one on there, I have this clip that I have to plug on to complete the circuit. The thing that you want to remember when you're soldering is you want the material to heat the solder. You don't want the soldering iron to heat the solder. That's how you know you get a really good joint. So what I do when I have a critical area that I need to solder, I like to just kind of tack on just a little bit of solder just to hold it in place while I'm actually, before I go and actually finish the rest of the work here. So when I hold the solder, I like to hold it in my hand like this, and then when I put solder on, I like to swipe it across the joint. If you put solder straight on the joint will suck up as much solder as you want to put on. So I prefer to actually swipe it a little bit. So what I do when I have a critical joint that I need to solder, I just put a little bit of solder up on top or wherever it is, just to hold it in place, and then I come back and I'll finish up everything. I don't want it to move. So I have a foot pedal underneath the desk here, and when that goes on, it pumps a lot of electricity. I've got this dialed up to 85 watts, and it will heat up very, very quickly. So now that I just tacked on the point to make sure that it's going to stay in place, then I can go through and actually finish everything else. So I'll put the iron on one side, and at this point you want to make sure that there's very little solder going on it because we still have to put the other rails next to it. So I let the joint heat up, and I can see how it flowed underneath, came out the other side, and it's looking really, really good. So at least I know that my frog is in the right position and it's soldered where I want it to be. And then I'll come back, and again, I like to put the solder on areas of the turnout that you aren't going to see. So I'm just going to put the solder this time kind of in between the two rails. And then I'm just going to put a tiny little bit right outside here. So when you do solder, you want to use, I like using an extremely narrow tip, so that way you can get the tip of the iron exactly where you need it to go. There we go. That's looking good. And then I'm just going to finish up this side right here. And when I'm done, I'll pull this out, and you can see the joints. That's looking good. I use the weights to hold it down because this little alligator clip will actually try to pull it out, but I will try to do this as best as I can right in front of you. I'm going heat that up. So I'm heating up the joint on one side and applying solder to the other side. So that way I know that my rail is actually heating up the joint and the iron is not melting the solder. So it goes very quickly. And we're just going to pop this in, get this last one done. And you can actually see it flow underneath the joint. So super quick. So you always want to make sure you have a good hot iron, the right flux, clean your rail first, and we're done. So just for a quick little demo, we'll pop this out and you can see just how nice and sharp those points are. And you can see just how nice and clean it is. You don't need to glob solder on everywhere to have a good joint. Just take it slow and everything will look just fine. And that turned out extremely well. I'm very pleased. And I'll actually, when we're done, I'll pull this apart and I can use these pieces again in another turnout. So that's a quick little demo on soldering points. So now I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. Just take a little bit of sandpaper on a sanding stick, and again, we're backwards here. So you can just see how nice and smooth that looks. So if you want to practice that, do that a couple times before you start your turnout, and I think you'll have really good results. The other thing that you can do is you can take some ties, and if you just want to practice building some straight track, you can do that in the fixture as well. So you can put some ties down. I just sanded those right before we started, so I know they're clean. And you can pop some ties in the fixture, just like that. Let me pull out this straight piece of rail we used as a demo earlier. And you can just practice soldering up some straight track in the fixture. So I'm just going to sand the bottom of the rail real quick just to get it nice and smooth, get that oxidation off. What's always nice is I get messages from the folks who watch the videos and they say they do these things and they are amazed at how much better their track work goes together and how much cleaner it is, and they're very pleased with what they do. So now that everything is sanded and etched, we want to put some flux down, and we're just going to go right down the line. So the other thing too is this shows you too that you can make straight track in a turnout fixture. And then you can always add ties later. So we're just going to add that paste flux going down here, going right down the line. And then we're going to add the rail. And again, before you put the rail in, you want to make sure that nothing is binding on the rail. When I was prepping for the video, one of the rails slid without a problem, but the other rail kind of fought me. And you got to remember that rail is not CNC machined, and there can be variations. So if your rail doesn't slide like what we're doing here, just take your file and swipe the side of the base of the rail, and that typically is enough to clean it up. So now that the rail is in place, we're just going to add a little bit of weight, and then we're just going to go right back down the line and add a little bit of flux to each side right here, and we're going to follow the same method as what we did soldering the points, except on here you don't need to tack anything down. You can just start at one end and work your way down, kind of like what I'm doing right here. So if you do, just like painting, if you do all your prep work properly, things are going to go nice and smooth. So now that we have flux on here, we can just go right down the line and we can tack this in place. And I'm putting the iron on one side, and then I'm going to apply solder on the other side. And that way, again, I know that my material is heating up properly. And I just swipe a little bit on. You saw a couple swipes there. The first two swipes didn't melt the solder yet, but on the third swipe, the joint was heated up. And you don't need a whole lot. You can just literally swipe the solder on, a little bit more right there, and that's looking good. So if you're using a regular iron, you can kind of apply that same philosophy, you know, get the point of the tip right on that base of the rail, since that's the widest part and that's where the most material is. You want to get that heated up. And if you can, apply the solder to the other side of the rail. I know that's not always possible in some situations while you're working on a turnout or a crossing. You have to apply the solder where you can put it. So by swiping it, you are controlling the amount of solder that is going on the joint versus just globbing it on. There's no need to glob it on. So we're just going right down the line here. Things are going pretty well. Gotta straighten out my solder a little bit. And once you get used to working in metal, I've heard the old timers say this, where you actually prefer working in metal versus styrene. And the more I do this, the more I agree with them, where if you do all your prep work just right, I need to put a little more flux on that side. If you do your prep work just right, the solder flows and is quite easy. And the nice thing is, if you do make a mistake, you can file things down. You can file it down. This one's fighting me for some reason. There we go. You can file it down and you can start over. And, you know, just like anything, if you catch any mistakes early before you get too far, most of them are easily fixable. And that applies too with track. If you are soldering and something doesn't look right, you can just go back, either refile it, make sure it's how it's supposed to look. Oh, that's much better. Make sure it's how it's supposed to look before you get too far in. And if you need to make an adjustment, it's easy doing that. So we're on the last joint right here. You're seeing how quick and easy that goes, and that's it. So we just soldered up some straight track, and we'll pull this out, and you can see just how nice and smooth those joints are. And I'll flip it around on this side. So that looks good. There's one that I want to clean up, but it just went that quick and easy. So there you go. There's a quick, short little demo. And remember, hot iron, clean, clean, clean. If it's not shiny, don't solder it. Use some sandpaper. 400 grit works great. Don't glob solder on. There's no need to do it. And just take your time and go slow. So that's it for today's Upstairs in the Workshop. Thanks everyone for watching. Appreciate it. Have a safe holiday and get out there and build some track. And we'll see you real soon. Thank you.